This is what happens when you value diversity over talent. This is what happens when you're so focused on balancing the scales of diversity. You're so focused on being inclusive. You let real talent walk out your door. And to make matters worse, you hang on to people that are incapable of drawing flies to a fresh turd. It has been 10 years since Colin Cowherd jumped off the Titanic known as ESPN Radio and took his talents over to Fox Sports. It was a massive mistake at the time for ESPN to let go of Colin Cowherd, especially when you realize why they decided to let him walk. One of the reasons that Colin Cowherd left ESPN, he wanted to expand his show. He wanted to digitize his show, wanted to embrace YouTube, wanted to expand to podcasting platforms. Eventually, he wanted to have a separate podcast outside of his show on ESPN Radio. Now, you got to remember, this was 10 years ago. This was before radio and cable crashed. This was before YouTube became the most watched platform. Colin Cowherd had vision, and it was a vision that ESPN just couldn't see. When Colin Cowherd left ESPN, their radio division was officially dead. Think about it. Can you name a single show on ESPN Radio today? Hell, does ESPN Radio still exist? I actually had to look it up. Somehow, ESPN Radio still exists if you can call this lineup an existence. Listen to some of these shows. Evan, Canty, and Michelle. Who, and who? Some doofus named Clinton and something ESPN is calling friends. Joe and Q. Who and what? I thought Q was reserved for identifiers who were questioning their gender, or questioning their sexuality, or questioning their emotional support walrus. I don't know what the hell they're questioning, but they're damn sure questioning something. The Q at ESPN Radio is probably questioning their career choices that led them to this graveyard. The point is, Colin Cowherd had vision. He saw where the future of broadcasting was headed, and he knew if he signed another contract with ESPN, he was going to be left behind. I've always respected his talent, but you've got to respect his courage. This dude walked away from the biggest sports media company in the world to join a startup at FS1. He bet on himself. He was willing to bet on his vision when ESPN was entering the early stages of being blinded by diversity. And it's not just Colin Cowherd that ESPN overlooked. Bill Simmons, Dan Lebitard, Ryan Russillo, Zach Lowe, who was their best NBA insider. ESPN laid off Zach Lowe, and they brought in Monica McNutt as an NBA analyst. Monica McDougal wasn't qualified to play in the WNBA dump, but somehow ESPN wants us to believe that she is qualified to analyze the NBA. All of these dudes have left ESPN and become successful in digital media. And according to Pablo Torre, this was a major mistake by ESPN that ended up costing them $1 billion. Make sure to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at KC_BTL84. Let's go and get to the sponsor of today's video, my good friends at BuzzBlocker. One of the most annoying things about being outside in the summer, besides the unrelenting heat down here in the South, one of the worst things about summer, mosquitoes and no-see-ums. A couple of weeks ago, I'm outside after a storm trying to grill. The mosquitoes were absolutely relentless. I came inside looking like a leper. In my experience, a lot of these repellents, they're ineffective. They seem to attract mosquitoes instead of repelling them, which is why I have started using mosquito repellent from Buzz Blocker. Buzz Blocker was created by a mother whose daughter was allergic to bug bites. When nothing else on the market worked, she decided to create something for her daughter that was effective. Buzz Blocker repellent is made from 100% organic ingredients and it's DEET free. More importantly, it actually works. I apply Buzz Blocker before going outside, and there's not a mosquito or no-see-um willing to touch me. When you're outside in the summer, you don't go outside without sunscreen. You should have the same mentality with mosquitoes and no-see-ums. Buzz Blocker comes with a money-back guarantee. If it doesn't work for you, which it will, but if it doesn't, you will get a full refund. So protect yourself this summer by clicking the link in the description below. Use my promo code BTL20. Save 20% off your first purchase with Buzz Blocker. Last week, Pablo Torre was the guest on something called the Mixed Signals podcast. KC, who in the hell is Pablo Torre? Several years ago, Pablo had the misfortune of being paired with Bomani Jones. They co-hosted a show on ESPN called High at Noon. While their minds might have been artificially elevated by substances, the one thing at ESPN that was not high at noon was their ratings, which isn't surprising since Bo Jones was involved. Everything Bomani Jones touches ends in huge embarrassing failure. But according to Bo, Pablo was the reason our show failed. I'm usually great at developing chemistry with men, but I could never develop chemistry with Pablo. Their partnership dissolved, and Pablo Torre launched a successful channel here on YouTube where he focuses mainly on investigative journalism. Show is called Pablo Torre Finds Out, and it was named after Pablo Torre found out Bomani Jones was a huge embarrassing failure. Meanwhile, Bo Jones, he continues to host Right Time to Be a Failure, and no one is watching it. But last week, Pablo Torre was a guest on Mixed Signals. They were talking about digital media and how ESPN allowed the major players to walk right out their door. Watch for yourself.
ESPN also is operating at such a level of billions and billions of dollars in TV rights deals, like the most valuable properties in sports and television, that when it comes to, you mentioned Zach Lowe, who is, the greatest at NBA podcasting. Zach and Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo and Dan Lebitard and Colin Cowherd, and throw me in there somewhere in the rotation if you want. But just like down the list, right? So that's Meadowlark, that's The Ringer, that's The Volume, that's some other stuff that's emerging. If you were to collect all of those guys and just do the math on that, ESPN legitimately let over $1 billion walk out the door. Now, they missed, I would argue, the future of sports podcasting that was already in-house, but the economics of why they let it go was because it was still fractional compared to their actual interests.
Pablo Torre is blaming this oversight on ESPN being so focused on live sports programming. The insinuation here, I think, is that ESPN is so focused on live sports and the billions of dollars that it generates every year, they're really not worried about podcasting. They're not worried about digital media. Pablo Torre could be right. I mean, he's worked at ESPN. He knows how they operate, but Uncle KC is having a hard time biting into that shit sandwich. I'm struggling to understand why live sports like the NFL or the NBA would divert their attention away from digital media, mainly because ESPN has a digital media platform. They have podcasts on their digital platforms, and they've had them for years now. The problem is, they got the wrong host. Instead of Colin Cowherd, you got L. Duncan. fuck wants to listen to L. Duncan? I'll tell you who. No one. If you don't believe me, go look at her shitty numbers. Instead of Zach Lowe, ESPN has a podcast with pretend NFL analyst Mina Kimes. Instead of Dan Patrick, who was the true visionary, Dan Patrick left ESPN 20 years ago to venture out on his own. Instead of Dan Patrick, ESPN has the Dominique Foxworth Show. The best podcast that ESPN has is the Brian Windhorst Show, and they can't figure out his contract. It's entirely possible at this point that Brian Windhorst could be leaving ESPN. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking because I've seen Pablo Torre get called out in comments. How is ESPN losing $1 billion in podcasting? There's no way podcasts are generating that kind of money. It's hard to understand how much money there is in this business until you're actually in it. Now, I don't know if it's $1 billion, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Whether it's $1 billion or $500 million, either way, ESPN is missing out on that revenue because they let all of their homegrown talent walk out the door. And a lot of these dudes, they have gotten bigger since they left ESPN. I think ESPN recognized their mistake a few years ago. It's the reason they allowed Stephen A. Smith to launch his own platform. It's the reason they gave Stephen A. the freedom to sign with SiriusXM. They can't afford to lose another star. Hell, Stephen A. Smith, he's their only homegrown star. ESPN is so desperate for star power, they had to go out and buy Pat McAfee. They've spent the last few years so focused on diversity. They've let all their real talent leave. It doesn't make sense. Outside of live sports, ESPN really doesn't have a strong business model. They don't have anything on television worth watching. Where do you get your sports content? Are you watching ESPN, or are you listening to Colin Cowherd or your favorite YouTuber? There are dudes sitting in their bedrooms breaking down film better than most of the so-called analysts at ESPN. If you're a fan of the Oklahoma City Thunder, you're not watching ESPN. They never talk about your team. You're probably watching local guys on YouTube who cover the team every day. The point Pablo Torre was trying to make, this was a missed opportunity for ESPN. And it's not like they were unaware. It's not like it caught them by surprise. Colin Cowherd presented them with the opportunity 10 years ago. They weren't willing to listen. And now they're stuck with a lineup of unknowns on ESPN radio and a podcasting network that resembles a nicely polished turd. Give me your thoughts on this. Do you agree with Pablo Torre? Was this a $1 billion mistake for ESPN? Whether it's $1 billion or not, ESPN definitely lost potential revenue, potential earnings. They should be the leaders in sports podcasting, and instead, ESPN isn't even in the conversation. Was ESPN too focused on balancing the scales of diversity to recognize the talent that they had? You tell me. Sound off in the comments below. I'll see you guys tomorrow.